Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you all back to the English Soldier Speaks English channel. And today I've got a very interesting guest with me. Giovanni Ulleri is a sort of a legend once we talk about the National Union of Journalists and once we talk about the British media. And we are very honored to have him as our guest today. And without further ado, we would first of all welcome Giovanni. And Giovanni, I would ask you to introduce yourself to the audience, and please do talk about your the background, your heritage of Sardinia, which gives you that which I understand gave you the motivation to become the investigative journalist and speak truth to power. So over to you. Please introduce yourself to the audience.
Thank you so much, Adil, for inviting me on your podcast. It's wonderful to be here. And I feel very privileged to be in such good company. Let me tell you a bit about my background. So I am the son of Italian immigrants. My parents, both Sardinia. Now, Sardinia is an island, I don't know whether you know, in the middle of the Mediterranean, very independent country. On my father's side, my father comes from a background of communists. I don't know whether you've heard of a philosopher, Italian philosopher called Antonio Gramsci. Antonio Gramsci was a very famous philosopher, communist, revolutionary communism. Hegemony was he wrote a book called The Prison Diaries, arrested during the time of Mussolini, the fascist leader of Italy. And so my father's side were communists from that background. And in fact, my grandfather was imprisoned with Gramsci during the war. So all my father's side of the family were all communists. My mother, on the other hand, is related to the Marquis of Sardinia. In terms of have you ever had a pizza called a pizza margherita? Well, my auntie was a chief maid to the Queen of Italy, and they used to have they used to own swathes of land in Sardinia. And my father met my mother because my granddad used to look after some of the land, and my father and my mother fell in love. So, in fact, my father, after the war, there was very little work in Italy. So he applied to various countries legally when immigrants were welcomed. It's all changed now these days. But in those days, after the war, he applied for various countries and stuff. He was going to go to America at one point. But the British at the time, they were looking for miners, and some of my father's family, because of the communist background, they worked in the coal mines in Sardinia. So my father ended up, to get his work permit to come to the UK, he spent 4 years working down the coal mines in Lancashire, and he became a miner. So, and then my mother joined. My father, in fact, was married by proxy. He had to be married to have his partner coming over. So my uncle married my mother in Sardinia officially, so they were officially married. So my father never even went to his own wedding, and they. So my mother then, because she was officially legally married.
The Pakistanis can understand this very well, actually.
All right. Yeah. So my father brought my mother over, and my father was always, even though he left school when he was 11. He didn't have much of an education, but he was extremely well read. Again, because of the communist background and stuff, my father read everything. He was, I remember reading Nietzsche to him in English. Thus Spoke Zarathustra. I remember it well as one of the books I had to read to him. He was self-educated, but he believed in education. So one of the things that he did do, being an immigrant and stuff, he always said to me and my other family members, that you need to study hard, son, because that's the only way. Someone who's educated and stuff. That's where you'll always be blessed if you've got an education and stuff. Money comes and goes, but education will always stay with you. So he always emphasised education. Anyway, to cut a long, boring story short, he came to the UK at a time when there was lots of National Front, the fascist party of the UK, which there's been a resurgence recently as well with members of the far right and Tommy Robinson and people like that marching and stuff. And I always remember as a child coming home one day and my father was scrubbing paint off the walls because members of the National Front had spray painted our house and stuff. And there was a really strange atmosphere in the early 70s in the UK and stuff. I've got an Italian name and stuff, and I was the only one with an Italian name, a foreign name in my school. And there was lots of racism then, but I didn't understand what racism was and stuff. And my father always said to me, just be careful because you'll always be an outsider in the UK. And that's the way I've felt most of my life. I've been an outsider looking in. I've never felt British. I feel connected with my Italian roots, but I've never felt fully Italian. And I think in a strange way, that's helped my journalism in the sense of being an outsider looking at the world and being able to relate to the world. Also, just to add to the family situation, my eldest brother had Down syndrome. And back when he was born in 1957, the doctors at the time said that they should lock him away and throw away the key. In those times, it wasn't called Down syndrome, it was called Mongolism, and it was a source of embarrassment. My mother's side of the family blamed it on the fact that my mother married a peasant, a communist, and the firstborn son being Down syndrome is the wrath of God, to which my father laughed and stuff. But you can understand that mentality then in terms of that background. And one thing I'm really proud of is that my father welcomed my brother with Down syndrome like there was nothing unusual about it. He was one of us. He was normal like everybody else and stuff. And he treasured him all his life, and he looked after him up until a few years before he died. And I'm really proud of that because again, it's that thing of pride in one's family, looking after one's family, and also not listening to other people that would try and influence you and stuff. My father, again, was very much an outsider like me, and in terms of that, and it gave me that sense of injustice. It gave me a sense which is inbuilt. I believe passionately in the power of journalism and the importance of journalism and getting your facts right. In this time we live in of fake news, manipulation, deep fakes and all of that, going to original sources, speaking to people, talking to people, not judging anyone. And that's one thing that I think unites us all, is that don't judge anyone until you've been there and walked in their shoes. So you're going to say, I interrupted you.
Yeah, no, Giovanni, coming to this, what you're talking about, definitely, it's an inspirational story, definitely. And let me say this, please, that whatsoever you are saying, I can exactly relate to it, because this is a story of immigrants, and immigrants have built the United Kingdom. The modern UK is built on the immigrants' back, and they all feel the same, what you're saying over here. And they're horrified by the far right protests and by the likes of Tony Robinson, whatever, as you can see. Yeah. So, but since you were talking about journalism and the fake news stuff, so please could you briefly walk us through your experience as an investigative journalist and as a producer and director? And, could you walk us through that journey?
Yeah, I need to just go back a bit, if you don't mind, if you bear with me.
Yeah.
So, from an early age, like I said to you before, having witnessed myself people marching with skinheads in the streets of Manchester in the 70s, late 70s and stuff, from that early age, I've always wanted to be a journalist. I myself was beaten up by 4 members of the National Front. When I was younger, I had dreams of being a footballer. And I was known for my school for being one of the best players. In fact, I had trials for Manchester City, Man United, Blackburn, very soon. Blackburn were doing quite well in those years and stuff. Anyway, someone didn't like me, and I was set upon by 4 members of the National Front, and they broke my leg in 3 places, and I went to hospital. And the surgeon at the time, when he put my leg together, said that you'll never be able to run properly, and you'll never be able to walk again properly. I mean, I did because I was defiant and stuff, but I was never able to play football again. And the attack happened 2 weeks before I was due to have football trials for an apprenticeship at Manchester United. So as a 15-year-old, that devastated me, and I tried to commit suicide as a 15-year-old. And I was sectioned under the Mental Health Act, and I went to hospital, and I was there for 4 months as a 15-year-old in an adult psychiatric unit in Manchester. It was, I can't explain to you, at the time I just wanted to end it all. My mother had died of cancer a few years before. My father was looking after my eldest brother who had Down syndrome. I've got another brother who's 2 years older than me, who was also doing his O-levels at the time. And I've got a younger sister who was 4 when my mother died. I was 11 when my mother died. And my father, stubborn Sardinian that he is, was trying to look after all of us. And he never once claimed any benefit and stuff. He was living off money that he'd earned. He became a tailor, a master tailor in Manchester, and had his own shop, tailor shop in Manchester. And he looked after us. But I thought my life had ended then. And it was only because, I'll be honest with you, when I was in the hospital, I saw a film by a journalist called John Pilger. In fact, I'll just show you. I've got this book here. John Pilger. In the Name of Justice, the television reporting of John Pilger by Anthony Hayward. I recommend it to your viewers to watch it. That's John Pilger, Australian guy, wrote for The Mirror. I watched a film that he made when I was in hospital called Year Zero, about Cambodia and the genocide in Cambodia. And that film changed my life. I saw that film, I thought, I want to be like him.
How did it change your life? Could you
It was so powerful. It was one of those things where journalism could change the world. He brought a story about what went on in Cambodia that was so moving and so powerful. And I remember there's a series on British television narrated by, it's called The World at War. And it was narrated by Sir Laurence Olivier. He was a very famous British actor, Sir Laurence Olivier. And that had archive footage of the Holocaust and what went on in the camps. And in fact, one of the cameramen there was a guy called Bernstein, who ended up forming a TV production company in Manchester called Granada Television. And that's important because Granada Television had a program on TV, which was it was probably the best investigative current affairs program on British television at the time, and it was called World in Action. Pilger was working for World in Action. And I remember seeing World in Action and thinking, goodness me, these are people who are trying to make the world a better place. Journalism is about exposing injustice, corruption, giving a voice to the voiceless. And that was the thing of the program. That was the ethos of that program. Years later, and I'll go back a bit, but years later, when I got offered a contract as a junior researcher on World in Action, it felt like I was signing for Manchester United. I can't explain to you. It was like that moment where I felt like I'd made it. I'd arrived. I was working with some of the best journalists in Britain, giving a voice to the voiceless. Panorama was our opposition on the other side, but I always felt that Panorama didn't speak for me. Like I said, I come from a working class background. It was Panorama was for the middle class. It was for posh white people. Whereas World in Action stuff went all over the place, and they spoke to me. They were the ones, again, for your viewers, if they do a bit of background research, there were 6 working class Irishmen in Birmingham during the late 70s, early 80s, during the Birmingham pub bombings, where the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, were bombing Britain. And these 6 Irish guys were arrested, beaten up by the police, and convicted. And everyone at the time said they should hang. They were talking about bringing back the death penalty for these 6 people because so many people died during the Birmingham pub bombings. The fact that they were innocent. Now, World in Action was the only documentary program on British TV at the time that actually said, hang on a second, these people didn't do it. And they actually made a number, it became a bit of a campaign for World in Action where they actually tracked down the real bombers and they interviewed them. There's a guy called Chris Mullen who later became an MP who was a researcher on that program. There was a drama documentary made about it and stuff. I mean, and when members of World in Action were knocking on doors in Birmingham, speaking to people, they had urine thrown at them. They were threatened. They were beaten up because they were, you know, at the time they were saying, you know, why are you defending that? They're all Irish. They're all the same. You know, they all deserve, you know, no matter what. In the same way as people talk about the Palestinian, you know, if you support the Palestinian, well, they're all the same. They're all Hamas anyway. And that's what I'm saying to was at the time, it was that same, you know, feral viewpoint that was going on and stuff. And World in Action was the only program that actually said, hang on a second, you know, what about the truth? Let's examine the truth. And so, like I said, you know, for me, joining that program was probably the highlight of my life and stuff. And I always remember that day walking in there and feeling like I'd arrived and I felt, you know, accepted, you know, the son of an Italian communist working for probably the best investigative current affairs program on British television at the time that was prepared to do programs that nobody else would touch and prepared to give a voice to people who didn't have one. And the ethics and integrity of those journalists, I mean, they're my friends to this day and stuff. Unfortunately, the commercial thing changed and ITV changed and they got rid of World in Action. I mean, we used to get average audiences back then of 11, 12 million, which is unheard of now. I mean, you know, to get that at that time and stuff. And all the work I did then, I'm really proud of the work we did. We did at World in Action back in the day. And you know, they got rid of it and they brought in an American type 60 Minutes type show, which is more commercial. But the level of investigative stuff that they did wasn't as much. We didn't get time. We were always told at World in Action, investigate, but make sure you get it right and stuff. And that's what we did. We do it with ethics and integrity and stuff. And unfortunately now, and we would sometimes we spend a year doing an investigation. You don't get that time anymore now. And it was the time thing. You know, they did a brilliant program exposing a guy called Jonathan Aitken, who was then a member of the Conservative government, tipped to be Prime Minister, in fact. And they did an investigation into him, and he had to resign because of it. And there was a famous, again, and if people Google Jonathan Aitken, he gave a famous speech where he claims to uphold truth and justice, and he holds, you know, he was going to hold a sword up, and he was going to get rid of corrupt journalism and stuff. It turned out he was a complete liar, and he ended up going to prison for perjury. And it was all, again, you know, but it was only World in Action that would do that and stuff. And I feel very proud, as part of my DNA is that spirit and ethos, working with those particular journalists and stuff, to do that. Unfortunately, you know, the climate has changed since then and stuff, but my years spent there were some of the best years of my life.
Giovanni, before we move on to the World in Action in Afghanistan, where you have served, right? Just give me, you've explored the wider BBC scandals. We've been talking about it over here. Can you highlight the recurring patterns which you have observed, like bullying, internal politics, leadership crisis? Is there a recurring pattern, or I mean, things have gone to?
I think, again, if you're going to talk about, I mean, I worked at the BBC. I worked on an investigative before I joined World in Action. I spent 6 years on a radio program called Face the Facts with John Waite. John Waite being the presenter, and I experienced my time at the BBC, and with our small little investigative unit on radio, where we do half-hour investigations and stuff. I was at New Broadcasting House. I was a producer there, But what was interesting at the time was that the BBC at the time, and again, it's changed a lot since I was there, and that was, like I said, that was late 80s. It was very white, very middle class, a very public school, and there was a very I thought very patronizing atmosphere there in terms of the management and stuff, even though the BBC has got such a great ethic, and it was to educate, inform. I can't remember the third one, the Reithian doctrine at the BBC, and I think that the whole atmosphere there was quite competitive, in the sense that you get the 6 o'clock news competing with the 10 o'clock news, and you get Newsnight competing with Panorama and stuff, and it was all different factions and stuff. Instead of being one whole thing, it seemed to be very tribal with different groups and stuff. And at the time, I just remember feeling, unlike in radio where people we would help each other, I noticed with other areas that they were very anti each other. I mean, for example, I did an attachment, they call it. I did an attachment on Panorama, and the Panorama program would go out and stuff, and I'd get into the office, and then I'd hear people talking about the Panorama they watched the night before with one of their colleagues, and people say, "Oh, did you watch last night's program? Wasn't it terrible?" And they would literally undermine their colleague, saying how dreadful their program was, and how it was it was this and it was that and stuff. And then the person would come in and they would say, "Oh, enjoyed your program last night." And you just think,
that's common everywhere. Professional jealousy and hypocrisy is common everywhere, isn't it?
But it was, well, you say that, but I never experienced that, because I genuinely believe that you have to work as a team, as particularly when you're doing investigations, because sometimes these are long drawn out, and you face enough hurdles as it is without your own colleagues trying to undermine you or stab you in the back and stuff. And I didn't like the atmosphere, and I'll be honest with you, I kind of it felt toxic and stuff, and it felt tribal. It felt like you weren't. It was almost like you weren't interested in doing journalism because of the importance of journalism. You were doing it as a competitive thing to try and get awards or win awards, or to try and get up the slippery slope and stuff, and to make a name for yourself. It wasn't about trying to find stories that make a difference and stuff. I mean, I always question this when I speak to young journalists. I say to them, "Why do you want to do this? Because it's not that well paid. You get ridiculed. I mean, particularly now, it's even worse with social media. You get hung, drawn, and quartered by social media. If you're on screen, you get ridiculed because of the way you look, your appearance, the way you talk, or whatever. So why do you want to do this?" And I do believe that you've got to have a resilience, and you've got to, like yourself and stuff, you've got to do it because it's important work that you do in a democracy. It's our job as I believe it's a vocation, that you have to, the stories that you do, are to give voice to the voiceless, and to make a difference, and to hold power accountable, and to make sure that if people are corrupt, that they're exposed for being corrupt and stuff, dishonesty, and you expose that. And that's why we as journalists as well have got to watch ourselves and our behavior in terms, so we don't treat people, that's what annoys me is that they accuse somebody else, yet when somebody looks at their behavior and stuff, and they think, actually, well, you're hardly a shining example yourself. I'm not saying that you have to be pious or righteousness, but at the same time, we are in positions of responsibility in terms of holding people to account. So we have to look at our own selves as well. So when I've known journalists who are corrupt and stuff. I've worked with journalists who are corrupt and stuff, and and they often chase the exclusive at the expense of integrity, ethics, and proper journalism. And I've always called that out, and that's been to my detriment in terms of my own career. But if I see something my own colleagues are doing which is unethical, I have a duty to report that. And that's the thing, going back to the BBC, where I think, there was a famous TV presenter called Jimmy Savile, who turned out he was a paedophile and he was corrupt. But the BBC, he was one of their main anchors on the Top of the Pops program. He had a famous show at the BBC where he would fix it for children to get a dream, whatever their dream wish. And then it was called Jim Will Fix It For You. So if you were a child, you could write into Jimmy Savile saying, I want to meet, I don't know, the famous singer of the day and stuff. And he would fix it for you. It turned out, like I said, he was abusing women, children for many, many years. And it was kind of known about. But it was all hidden away. And when Newsnight started investigating it, the story was pulled, and senior management pulled it because he was a BBC asset. And this goes back, you go through in terms of other people, at the BBC. Recently Hugh Edwards, who was the main anchor for the 10 o'clock news, turned out that, he was involved in pornography and child abuse, not abuse in terms of the photographs. He was having pictures, and he was convicted of that and stuff. So, there's lots of personal things that you've got to be aware of, and I do think that we as journalists as well should call out other journalists who are not behaving as ethically as they should, because we're the ones holding other people to account, but we should hold ourselves to account as well. So, any journalists out there, if you see someone who's another journalist behaving unethically, you should call it out too. It's important to do that because, we need to call out, we need to get rid of, all it takes is one rotten apple to infect everybody and stuff. And so I'm kind of, I often get criticized for speaking out about these things, but I think it's important to do that because I think, we need to weed out the bad apples from amongst us and stuff. And that's why it's important with the NUJ as well, that we do that and we do call it out and stuff. And we do hold ourselves accountable. As much as we hold other people accountable, we need to hold ourselves accountable too. If I make a mistake, not deliberate or knowingly, I correct it immediately. You have to say, look, yeah, you know what, I got that wrong. And, it's important I got that. And you hold your hand up to that. And there's nothing wrong with that. I always say to young journalists, please, if you make a mistake, come to me and we'll fix it. What's always worse is when you cover things up. And unfortunately, that's been the cover up is always worse than the actual mistake. And, you go back all the way through in terms of every scandal possible. It's always the cover up that gets, that makes it worse. People own up at the time to something that they've done wrong or a mistake they've done. It's far better. And that's what I'm saying, don't be frightened. I'd much rather you come to me and say, I made a mistake, rather than try and cover it up. And then we find out afterwards, because I'll never be able to trust you. Because the important thing at the moment with anything in terms of journalism is trust. And as a journalist, when you lose trust, it's gone forever. Like I said to people, young journalists, when I speak to them, you can only lose your reputation once. Once it's gone, it's gone. So the only person that you can look yourself in the mirror every morning and hold your hand up and say, you know what, I did the best I could and I corrected the mistake at the time. And that's why I always say to you, it's always best to do that because, protect your own reputation. Don't listen to other people and stuff, who are covering themselves and stuff because, they didn't have the courage to stand up and stuff. Always call it out. If you see something doing wrong, see someone doing wrong, call it out. Whether it's bullying, and I've witnessed bullying. I have personally called it out, and it's cost me in terms of jobs. When I've called it out. But at the end of the day, I would rather work with someone who values me and values my integrity and my ethics than someone who I don't trust and who won't support you when when the situation arises, when there's a problem and stuff, they'll throw you under the bus as soon as look at you. So you must always protect yourself. Sorry, I'm rambling on. I do apologize.
No, but it's very interesting. What Suri is saying is very interesting. It's journalism 101 for the journalist, definitely. But talking about journalism, you once said that your work is motivated by what's hidden and what's not being told. So
Yes.
how do you decide? How do you decide which stories to focus on and which sources to trust?
That's a very difficult thing. I always, people say to me, how do you build trust? How do you get trust? And how do you find the stories? I always think that stories are a bit like layers of an onion. There's a surface area and stuff, and then you've got to try and peel away the layers. But the key thing is speak to people on the ground. You can't do your journalism on the phone, or you can do your journalism on the phone, but it's not as effective. I always think talking one-on-one with people, meeting them face to face, having a coffee with them, spending some time with them, letting them get to know you and you getting to know them and stuff, building that rapport. Sometimes these things can take years. I still have contacts of mine I've known for nearly 40 years who've trusted me from years back, who still come to me with their stories because they know I will protect them. They'll know I never reveal my sources. Like you, I won't reveal my sources. And they know that when I tell them something, when they tell me something rather, they know I will respect them and I'll be fair to them, and I'll do it ethically and responsibly, and I'll make sure that we uncover exactly what's going on. Truth is like a rock, I always think. Whatever angle you look at it, people have different angles of it, but the essential bit of the rock, the truth, doesn't change. And whatever people say, the truth is the truth, and you can't escape from that. And whatever people may put interpretations on the truth and stuff, but the truth doesn't change. Whatever angle you look at it, the truth is that facts are facts and stuff. And we as journalists and stuff, the essential thing is find out what the truth is. If someone says to you, it's pouring with rain outside and stuff, the job of the journalist is to go outside and check. And when they come back, you say, well, no, actually, the sun is shining outside. I've seen it because I've checked it. I've borne witness. We bear witness and stuff. So I do think that journalism, like I said, it's important that, the officials may say one thing to you and stuff, but when you get on the ground and speak to the people on the ground who are suffering it, and that's why, like I said, with the recent conflicts in terms of Gaza and everything, that's why the Israeli government, didn't like the fact that there were journalists on the ground in Gaza because they thought they wouldn't allow journalists in, but they didn't appreciate the fact that there were journalists on the ground recording what was going on and stuff. And that's why they tried to kill them. That's why there's been more journalists killed in Gaza in the last 2 years than any other place in the world, because they don't like the truth. And that's the thing that they couldn't control. Israel could not control the journalism, because you could see it with your own eyes. It was played out on national TV and stuff, and they couldn't control that. They dismissed it as being all Hamas this and Hamas that. Well, actually, people could judge for themselves what was going on because there was video evidence of it, and they couldn't deny it. I mean, and that's the power of journalism. That's why it's so important that we protect journalism in democracies and stuff, that we protect the truth, because in these days now, you've got to be so careful with social media, because people who call themselves journalists and stuff but aren't journalists at all, they're propagandists, and that's what they are. They're propagandists and stuff. And we need to differentiate the propagandists from the journalists that go to the sources, that speak to people on the ground, that don't have an agenda, that are fair, balanced, independent, and that we get sources, facts, and truth, and and focus on that. That's the point of being a journalist. And for me, it's a vocation. It's important in a democracy that we do that and stuff. And I think that's often forgotten and stuff. Like I said, with social media, it's differentiate the propagandists from the true journalists.
That's what I wanted to come to. In the era of artificial intelligence, the Pakistan's biggest newspaper today published this article. The main, it's Dawn. Dawn is supposed to be a legendary English paper in Pakistan. It's got a history of going back 100 years or so. All right. So it's a paper which is being published before partition. So today they published the main story, which is a sort of a propaganda piece, mind you. But it was an AI written piece, and AI's junk was published in the print edition, where the AI is telling, asking a newspaper that, do you want me to draft another this, blah, 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 the junk, and they just published it out. So in the era of social media, and they did issue the clarification, but by that time the print edition has gone out and it wasn't print. So in an era of social media, live streams, the one we're doing right now, and real-time reporting. I mean, if you're doing a real-time reporting, the things are moving so fast, and you have to report them there and then. Like there are 3-4 major events in one region or even one country, and you have to report them there and then, because otherwise it becomes old news. Because the life cycle of a news these days is not more than 24 hours, unfortunately. So do you believe traditional broadcasters face greater risk of institutional failure or greater opportunity for accountability in this present day and age?
It's never been more difficult, and I think that obviously the Gaza conflict is a case in point there, where they call it legacy media now, don't they? In terms of traditional media, weren't able to go in. But there was still some fine journalism going on. I mean, the problem is that outside pressure, when you've got lobby groups, I mean, like I said, the Israeli government, have got a very pronounced, very well-resourced lobby in America, and in the UK, that are able to influence all the networks and stuff. But what was interesting is they couldn't control what was happening on the ground, because there were so many good journalists there reporting. And even though they're trying to smear them and kill them, the truth got out, and that's the thing they can't escape from. I always think with anything, it's just like truth in the end will always.
Giovanni, sorry to cut you short. Yeah. Social media gets the credit for bringing the truth out from there.
Yes, exactly. No, exactly. But we've got to be. I think also we have a responsibility as a viewer, and also as a consumer of journalism, to make sure that we do our own research as well. I mean, this is the thing. The great thing of AI at the moment is that it's quite immediate and quite quick and stuff. But you've got to be aware of the algorithm. You've got to understand what's going on. And if you're being manipulated and being used, because otherwise, it's an echo chamber, isn't it? Where if you like certain things, I mean, the wonderful Carol Cadwalladr exposed this in terms of what went on with Cambridge Analytica and stuff, and the fact that if you, I think it was someone that she interviewed was saying, if you click on Facebook, for example, or X or Twitter as it then was, if you click on certain things that you liked, within 5 clicks, the algorithm already knows more about you than your own family knows about you, in terms of your likes, your dislikes, the things that and then they can target advertising to you, which market that. Now that's frightening. I mean, it's not so frightening if you think they're just targeting adverts at you, but when it comes to targeting political information to you, that's when it becomes frightening. Because, for example, as she was saying, you could have in one family where one person's concerned that, say your partner's concerned about the rising level of crime, for example, and they can then target you with malicious disinformation, which increases your prejudices that all these immigrants that are coming over, they're all rapists and pedophiles, and they're going to kidnap your children and they're going to rape them, and then you get targeted with this misinformation stuff. So therefore, yeah, I am going to vote for, the extreme right or reform or UKIP or whatever it is that emphasize that. And then if you're the husband concerned about, I don't know, the economy and stuff, they can target you with other stuff there, which is going to say, if you don't vote for Brexit and stuff, there's going to be Turkey is going to come, be open up, and we're going to get thousands of Turkish immigrants. They're going to take your job off you and stuff. So within one family, you're going to be bombarded via social media and your algorithm by that's manipulated by other forces, And that's the thing where we've got, as consumers, we've got to be aware of this. And that's why it's interesting. If you look behind Trump on his inauguration, who were the people that were supporting him, the billionaires sat behind him? They were all these social media barons. Back in the day, they owned newspapers, but newspapers are finished, aren't they, really? And it's social media now. And that's why, that's why Elon Musk bought Twitter and turned it into X. And I noticed, I don't know whether other people have noticed this, but all my social media on X has become so toxic, and it's so dark in terms of some of the terrible stuff that they are promoting, which goes unchallenged. And so all these people that were banned when it was Twitter are now back on there promoting all this nonsense and stuff, which no one questions. And that's what's frightening. But we as journalists have to.
Giovanni, elections are being won. Sorry to cut you short. Elections are being won by manipulating the social media, as you were talking about your friend Karen Calvado, about Cambridge Analytica story. And it's still going on. The Cambridge Analytica might have closed, but there are other Cambridge Analytica.
No, exactly.
It's $1 billion business. They're not going to stop at anything.
But that's why I think there has to be good journalists and good journalism out there, which exposes that, which highlights that, which informs people that they are being manipulated in that way. And I think that's why there's never been a greater time for journalism. When I go and speak to journalism colleges, I say to them, you know what? We need you. We need good people, ethical people, people who know how to differentiate from something that they've seen somewhere in terms of the prejudices that they espouse, who say things. And you can say, hang on a second, let's examine what you just said. Where's the evidence for that? Where have you got the truth for that? I am always correcting people. And sometimes I'm corrected, and I always say, please correct me. I mean, educate me. I make mistakes and stuff. And like I said before, I'll correct my mistakes. And if I've got something wrong, I'll hold my hand up and say, yo, I got it wrong. I'm sorry. I mean, we're always learning and educating. But I always say to people, where is the source for what you said? Where does that come from? Why are you saying that? I mean, you know yourself from the NUJ and stuff. We're not perfect. People come out with all sorts of their own prejudice and stuff. And I always examine my prejudices and stuff as well, thinking, why am I thinking like that? Why am I saying that? Where did that come from? Like I said, from my own background and stuff, with my own outside influences and stuff. I always think, because some of my friends and stuff say, oh, well, we don't mean you, when we say that and stuff. Some people say, oh yeah, they should all go back from where they came from and stuff, even if they weren't born here. So what, like me, you mean? I'm an immigrant. I'm son of an immigrant. Oh, well, we didn't mean you. We didn't mean you, Gio, and stuff. You're one of us. Well, no, actually, I'm not one of you. And that, what they mean by that is like, I am not British, born and bred with generations coming from Britain. So I'm a son of immigrants and stuff, and I'll always be the son of immigrants. And I'm proud of my immigrant roots and stuff. But I am British Italian, and that's my background and stuff, and it makes me, even more proud of how immigrants have built this country and stuff. And we're not going anywhere. I'm not going anywhere and stuff. I mean, and I think it's important and stuff in this climate that we've got at the moment, this toxic climate where people are marching with Union Jacks and stuff and up and down. Espousing all this nonsense and stuff, which is not truthful at all. And it's interesting again because of, I'm always, when people post stuff, I always write stuff on X and stuff saying, hang on a second, there's more white people committing rape, rape gangs and stuff than there are other people, brown people that you keep highlighting when there's all these grooming gangs and stuff. So, but they're all from certain ethnic origins. Well, no, they're not. That's not true. Factually, that's wrong. And you need to call it out every single time. I mean, it's tedious, but I think it's important to call it out and stuff because people buy into that myth. And I think we as journalists have to call it out. That's our job. Every single person who calls themselves a journalist has to call that out. That's your duty and that's your job. To go along with it and not to, that's why I get frustrated and stuff because people call themselves journalists and I don't believe they are. They're propagandists and stuff. And that's why you see GB News with politicians going on there claiming that they are more independent than the BBC, for goodness sake. I mean, how outrageous, ridiculous that notion is. The recent thing with the Panorama mistake, which we could talk about that, because again, I am.
Yeah,
shocked.
what are your views about it? What are your views about it?
I'll be honest with you, I'm really disappointed in Panorama for not spotting that gross error. Everyone it's like stage one of journalism school. I don't know about you, but I am a news junkie. I watch everything in terms of current affairs. I have to. I love it, and it's my passion, and it's my job. But I do it because I want to keep informed, and I want to know what's going on. I remember Trump's speech, which lasted over an hour that day, and he was inciting people to do stuff. He wanted them to challenge. He wanted his vice president to stop it and stuff because he called it the steal, which was a lie. He if you remember, he had all these court cases, and he lost every single one where he called the election a steal. But I remember watching that, and then to watch the Panorama program, to see the way that they'd spliced a clip from the beginning of the speech with another clip an hour later, or nearly an hour later, 50 odd minutes later, whatever it was, at the end, and put them together. Everyone knows you can't do that. You have to write in saying, he then went on, he spoke for an hour, but then went on to urge his followers to X, Y, and Z. You can't say that was, it made it sound stronger than it was. You are not being fair to not only him, but you're not being fair to the viewer. You're not being fair to your audience by suggesting that was one clip, which is what the suggestion was. It was a basic error. Sorry.
So what you're saying, Giovanni, is that it was not a propaganda, but it was in fact whatsoever was done in the name of justice. And time constraint. It was fair editing. Is that what you're putting?
No, I'm not saying it was fair editing. I'm saying it was a stupid, basic error to clip Trump's speech into one, to make it appear as if it was one thing that he said. They should have made it clear that what he said at the beginning of the clip was from the start of his speech, and then the other thing when it said, I can't remember what he said, like, we're going to march, whatever he said at the end, and to make that appear that was one thing. They didn't need to do that. I mean, the whole speech was kind of like trying to raise the volume and stuff, and raise the tension and stuff. But to make that basic error, which was a basic, it was a naive. I don't know why that was allowed to do. I mean, I made a documentary for Dispatches on Channel 4 about the war in Iraq, where we managed to get an interview with the Attorney General at the time, Goldsmith, I think his name was, who gave the legal justification for the war in Iraq. I can't explain to you, Adil, the amount of time that we spent analysing the interview, making sure that we were fair to him, because this was the Attorney General. He's a lawyer, remember. Making sure that we were fair to what he was saying. Obviously, the interview we did with him was about an hour that we did, and we're only going to use 3 or 4 sound bites from it. But we had to make sure that those 4 sound bites were clearly fair to him, representative of what he was his argument that he was making, and that we weren't being manipulative in any way, shape, or form. And that was a fair representation of the arguments that he was making for justifying the war in Iraq. Now, that went through. I can't explain. We went through the transcripts. We went through looking at it again and again and again. We went through the whole program. Every single line of that script was analysed, discussed, factually checked, double-checked, triple-checked, sourced again. We went through, not only myself, with the editor, with the exec producer, with the head of compliance, with legals. And, this is the thoroughness that you have to go through, because if you make an error, not only do you lose your own reputation, but you lose the reputation of the program, you lose the reputation of the channel, which is what happened to the BBC. That's why I don't understand the processes that they did, and it's not been properly analysed in terms of how many people saw that clip, for example. How many people went through that? What was discussed? Because that, like I said, I remember at the time it was over an hour that speech he gave outside.
Fair enough.
And so I think it was I don't know whether they were, they were trying to rush the program out. I don't know whether there was time, but there's no excuse for that. And it was a basic error. It's a basic error, which is now cost a reputation.
Yeah. I definitely did get it. So, Giovanni, as I was saying, I would like to go on and on and on, but the thing is that what I wanted to ask you, the two main things, all right, which I wanted to ask you before I conclude this podcast, or we would love to have you back with us, and we would love to hear from you, and we would love it. It'll be a teaching point for the students of journalism, for myself even. All right, I've been learning a lot from you over the year. At the NUJ platform. But you had the lead of the Woodward case before I come to Afghanistan and your experience there, because that involves Afghanistan, Pakistan, and South Asia, and my audience would be very much interested in that. But finally, you had an exclusive of the Woodward case. So what were your experiences? And could you explain a small bit about the Woodward case, and then what were your experiences in the Woodward case?
So I was working on an ITV program called The Big Story with Dermot Murnaghan was the main presenter, the anchor of Dermot Murnaghan. The editor of the program was a woman called Dorothy Byrne, who then went on to run Channel 4 News and Current Affairs. And I remember Dorothy came in one day into the newsroom in the Current Affairs program and said she was having nightmares with her au pair, with her nanny. And so she said, right, everyone, I want you to find stories of au pairs from hell. Go and find out from stories that, if you've got any stories of that. So everyone went away. And I, at the time, was often the first in the office. And I would go to Euston Station at the time, and I'd pick up and buy all the newspapers from around the world. And I'd bring them into the office, and we'd spread them all out, and we'd go through them looking for stories. And I noticed a small little article in a paper in America, in Boston, where it said a British au pair, I think she was 17 at the time, Louise Woodward, had been arrested for shaking a baby to death. Small little nib, news in brief, in this paper in Boston. So we came in, and Dorothy said, right, guys, anyone got any stories and stuff about au pairs and stuff? And I said, well, in fact, Dorothy, yes, I have. I've seen this in the paper in Boston about this British girl called Louise Woodward, 17, from a place called Eltham near Liverpool, who's been accused of shaking a baby to death, and she's up for murder. So Dorothy said, great, get on a plane tomorrow, as soon as you can. So literally the following day, I had a float of $1,000, went out to Boston, checked into my hotel, I went straight to the court where she was being arraigned in Boston, in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'll never forget, because it's a big tower block where all the courtrooms are, in this tower block in Boston. I went in there, spoke to the clerk, and said, "Hello, I want to find all the motions that have been put into the court regarding this British girl, this 17-year-old girl called Louise Woodward." And they said, "Oh, you're interested in this case?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Well, it's $1 a page to photograph all the motions, because the defense solicitor and the prosecution file these motions into the court." Anyway, she came back, must have been about an hour later, with a folder full of all these motions, including all the medical evidence in these motions and stuff. My $1,000 went day one. My float had gone because I'd paid this. Anyway, I went back to the hotel, started going through them. And because of my journalism background before, I'd done lots of cases in coroner's court. So I knew the coroner in London at St Pancras Coroner's Court. And I rang him and I said to him, "Look, I don't understand the medical background, but I've got all these medical notes about this shaking baby case in America with this British girl he'd never heard of." So I said to him, "Would you mind looking at the medical stuff and see what you think?" Because at that time, like I said, I'm just finding out the facts. I wanted to make sure that I understood what the facts were. So I wanted him to explain to me on the medical stuff, because I'm not a doctor, what the medical reports revealed and stuff, because again, she was accused of shaking a baby to death, and I think blunt force trauma. So not only was she shaking the baby to death, but the medical examiner in Boston said she shook the baby to death and then slammed its head. And I always remember this, in the actual medical examiner, the coroner in America said that with a force equivalent for a child being thrown out of a second floor window and landing onto concrete. That was the medical examiner in Boston's words. And I remember thinking, oh my God, this nightmare nanny is horrific. What, she's a killer. She's a baby. I mean, in my own prejudging the case already, because just having looked at that and reading those words again, and that's come from the medical examiner. So I thought to myself, well, Dorothy back in London wanted to find a case of a nanny from hell. Well, I've got one. She's clearly a nanny from hell. If she's thrown, she's shaken a baby and then thrown, hit its head with a force equivalent, smashing its head. In my mind, I imagined, a smashed skull and everything and stuff. Anyway, the coroner immediately, when I faxed, in those days he used to fax it over, when I faxed all the medical reports over, he came back to me within 4 hours and said, "Gee, this is wrong." I said, "What do you mean it's wrong?" And stuff. He said, the coroner is completely wrong. I said, "What do you mean he's completely?" He's the coroner. He goes, "Yes, find out." And he sent me a list of 20 questions. He said, "Find out how many child cases that he's done a medical examination on, because I'm telling you, the guy is wrong. And you need to speak to this chap who is the world's expert on shaking baby syndrome. He's the guy that coined the phrase shaking baby syndrome." And he said, "I will contact him directly and I will send him the medical stuff, but you need to speak to him, because he will tell you, and he'll back me up, that this is not a shaking baby case. She could not have done what the prosecution and what the medical examiner said she did, because it just doesn't hold water." So immediately there, that's again where in America, just to let you know, in America at the time, and still is to this day, journalists can write what they want. There's no Police and Criminal Evidence Act where when somebody's arrested, there's only certain limited things you can say about them, because otherwise you'll prejudice the trial. You'll deny them justice. And in America at the time, they wrote on the big front page, baby killer, murderer, may she rot in hell, the witch, the nanny from hell. So I remember at the time, all the newspapers were trying to, even suggesting that Massachusetts to bring back the death penalty, to murder, to kill this 17-year-old au pair, because of what was written by the coroner. And journalists they didn't investigate it. They just wrote down what the coroner said and stuff, and that was reported as being reported, which is what, if you're a jobbing reporter on the Boston Globe or whatever, and the coroner says that, of course you'd write that down. So then someone puts a headline on it. But that was immediately denying her a fair trial because of that. So I think at the time they said that the jury were polled, and they were 89% predisposed for a guilty verdict before the trial even started. So imagine that, 89% of the jury pool, where they're going to decide your fate, 89% are predisposed for a guilty verdict. So you've got to swing, imagine a swingometer. You've got to go from 89% have already made up their own mind before hearing any evidence that you're guilty. And as a defense team, you've got to bring it back. And also remember that in America, you get what you pay for. So she had a public defender who is invariably a young person straight out of law college and stuff, who's never done big cases or whatever. So the chances of them being able to make a swing from 89% predisposed for a guilty verdict to bringing it even halfway through, it takes, politicians can't do that. It takes a lot to get that swing going and stuff. And to do that in terms of if you're a defense lawyer and stuff, it's nearly impossible. So the poor woman, the poor girl, she was 17. She's, I still think she's a young girl. My sister was the same age, more or less. And I kept thinking of my sister, if this happened to my sister, because she was in America on a gap year, before she goes to university. And I kept thinking that could have been my sister in the same situation there. So because of what the coroner in Britain had told me to speak to the expert, and I rang up from my hotel room in Boston, I rang up the world's expert on shaking baby case. And he said, Gio, this is not a shaking baby case. He said, according to the medical reports, there is no bruising under the arms. If you're shaking a baby, hold it under the arms.
Yeah.
So there would be bruising here
Yeah.
and here. Also, the neck. If the neck is swinging back, you imagine a baby's head swinging back and forth. Yeah. There would be tears on the neck and the head of the baby. In terms, if it's shaking baby. Also, he said the baby weighed 10 pounds, and to cause shaking enough to cause a subdural hematoma, to cause a bruise in the brain, would it would be a lot of shaking for over, he said, over 3 or 4 minutes. The baby weighed 10 pounds. If you pick up, back in the day when I used to do some weight training, pick up 10 pounds and try and hold it for 2 minutes and do that for 2 minutes. The best bodybuilder in the world couldn't do that. A 17-year-old girl, he said it's just impossible. Also, he said that there was no bruising on the head either. There's a hairline fracture where beneath it, that's where the blood clot was, the subdural hematoma. But it was a hairline fracture. There was no, so when the coroner says with a force equivalent to being thrown out of a second floor window and landing onto the concrete, I imagined that the medical reports would say there was a fractured skull. It was all like, there was no bruising under a CT scan anywhere on the child's body. So immediately you're thinking, he said, it's not a shaken baby case. There's something more going on. Also, he said that according to the medical reports, there was a fracture of the wrist, but he couldn't see, and the wrist fracture was dated. They did a histology whereby they can tell with how many carbon deposits are on the bone to say how old the fracture is. They can date it because of when you break a leg and stuff. Yeah. They can tell how old the fracture is because of the carbon growth when it starts to heal, and they can tell. And he said, according to the histology that was done on the wrist of the baby, it was 3 weeks old. Where's the histology for the fractured bit of the skull? There should be a dated that, because what he was saying was that happened the same time as this. Yeah, there's dated. They can say that was 3 weeks before, but there's no medical reports about the fracture here. Where was she 3 weeks ago? Well, it turned out 3 weeks before she wasn't there. So something happened 3 weeks prior to when the baby collapsed. Because what Louise said was that, as normal, the parents went to work, both of whom were doctors. The baby, both parents were doctors. Louise got up, bathed the baby, and all of a sudden the baby turned blue. She picked the baby up, and she admitted to shaking, but not the way that the prosecution described. But she thought she'd done something wrong, because she said, yeah, I picked it up, but not the way that they claimed that she did. They claimed that she shook the baby and was really angry with the baby and then smashed its head and stuff because she was so angry because the baby was disturbing her social life, etc. That's the way the prosecution portrayed it in court and stuff. Well, the truth is, she panicked and stuff and picked the baby up. Oh my God, and there's a huge difference in that. But also what's fascinating about the whole case was that I did all this within a day, 2 days of being in Boston from reading that small news in brief. No other journalist in Boston or anywhere had done any of the homework on this. And that's what I'm saying to you about the failure. We as journalists, should be truth getters, truth finders. We shouldn't be just reporting. I mean, half the time people just report stuff. If you say it's raining outside, yeah, it's raining outside. You don't go and check. Do you know what I mean? It's like, and that's the thing that I fail to see in terms of, truth is somebody somewhere doesn't want published. The rest is public relations. Not Oscar Wilde. It was George Orwell said that. Yeah. So, I'm no special journalist and stuff, but I realized from early on get to the truth. And that was what was interesting about that Louise Woodward case, is because I did all that groundwork. And what was interesting about it was that the world's expert on shaking babies said, you know what, Gio? He said, you should really, I'm going to send you all these different medically peer-reviewed studies that were done, which shows that a baby could fall from a fall of less than 3 feet. I mean, we're on camera, but a fall of less than 3 feet, and get a blood clot to the brain, a bruise behind the brain. And I said, well, how can you prove that? And he said, well, I'll tell you who can prove it. The Nazis did it. This is what I was going back to when I first started in terms of telling you about watching the world at war. Himmler was a doctor, Nazi doctor, that would take children. He dropped babies on their heads to see whether they would get a brain, a bruise on their brain. So he did scientific studies by dropping babies on their heads, and he proved that you can get a subdural hematoma from a fall of less than 3 feet. I mean, that's how horrific. So in other words, those studies proved that in terms of, that when the coroner in Boston clearly hadn't read all the research papers on it, because he said it was like being thrown from a second floor window onto concrete. In fact, you can get a blood clot to the brain of a minor fall of less than 3 feet and stuff. And that's what I'm saying to you in terms about getting the facts and the sources and the evidence and stuff. And all this was really important in terms of proving like the innocence by examining the facts and stuff. The problem is the American judicial system. It's all about, if you can get a good lawyer. And what was interesting again about the Louise Woodward case, it suddenly became a huge international thing between, this British girl.
After your publication.
Yes, well, I made 3 programs about it and stuff. The first one went out, and because we covered it on ITV, Court TV in America decided to cover it. Because Court TV decided to cover it, British TV, ITV, BBC, and it suddenly erupted in terms of 60 Minutes covered it. It became this big international. I mean, I urge people, Google it in terms of the Louise Woodward case and stuff. It became this international thing. And also what was really fascinating was it taught me how other journalists operate, American journalists operate and stuff, British journalists, the way the tabloid media operated and stuff. And, I was pictured arguing with people outside because of the way that they would thrust cameras in people's faces to try and get them to react to stuff and stuff. And there was this outrageous behavior going on. And it was really interesting because I was on the inside. Again, I urge people, if you go and Google the case, I provided all my research to the defense team. I mean, this was the other thing, Louise took a lie detector test in prison. Now, I spoke to lots of lawyers and stuff saying, well, and the thing is that Louise Woodward was in a maximum security prison. Bizarrely, in a place called Framingham. I thought it was kind of ironic that she's in a prison called Framingham, because in my book, I think they were kind of trying to frame her. And she had a public defender, a very, good, well-meaning person, but not really equipped to deal with such an important case where literally, she could spend the rest of her life behind bars. And like I said before, they were actually clamoring for the death penalty to be reintroduced because of the reporting, the poor reporting that had been done in Boston. So she was working for an agency called EFO Pair, and EFO Pair refused to pay for her for a proper lawyer for her to have, unless she took a lie detector test. Now, certain states in America will accept a lie detector test. And they're very, you can argue one way or another. I mean, spies are trained how to deal with lie detectors because, they monitor your heartbeat, they monitor your sweat and everything. And you've got, lines and stuff, all these different lines. And they ask you a question. And then if there's a slight jump, they can tell that, that's suggesting that you're lying. I mean, it's, I'm still myself skeptical about it. But we're talking about a 17-year-old girl here, unsophisticated. She's not yet done her A-levels. She's a young kid. So to even suggest that she could possibly fake that is kind of ridiculous in the first order. Anyway, she agreed to take a lie detector test in prison, in Framingham prison, maximum security prison. Now, any defense lawyer worth their salt would say, never ever take a lie detector test in prison, because if you fail it, the whole prison knows about it, and it'll be used in evidence against you. The fact that you took a lie detector test and you failed it and you've not disclosed that. So any lawyer worth their salt would say, no, do not take a lie detector test in a prison. If you're going to do one, you do it in the confines, if you can get out of the prison, and do it out of the prison where no one will know, and you keep it top secret, just in case you fail it, you know. Anyway, Louise, 17-year-old kid, took the lie detector test in prison and passed it with a top, I mean, like, not 100%, but something like, I think it was 94% and 95%. I think that was something like that. But all this was in the motions that were filed that I got hold of the very first day. And again, that had never been reported by the press because it didn't suit the picture that the American press were already portraying of her. They didn't print that. The fact that actually, because they were already, if I told you before, 89% predisposed for a guilty verdict. So when there was the fact that she took a lie detector test, not only did she take it, but she took it in prison and she passed it, they didn't report it. Why didn't they report it? It was almost like they had already had in their mind, like, instead of doing journalism, they'd already had a narrative that she was guilty, so just make her out to be guilty. So anything which made her more guilty, they would print and they would publish. Anything which suggests that actually she may not be guilty, they didn't report. So there's no balance or independence in terms of their own journalism. And again, that struck me at the time as being odd. Why didn't they report that? You know, that's, you know, as a journalist, you report the facts, don't you? And that was a fact. She did take it there. The motions are there. And it was another story to the bow. But they didn't use that because it's already, in their mind, she was already guilty. And that's how the media can operate. They all can get together with a story, you know, and put that out without questioning. We as journalists have to question. I mean, don't get me wrong. In my mind, I wasn't convinced either way. In terms of, I'd not made up my own mind about Louise Wood. All I wanted to know was, I wanted corroborated evidence that you could argue and you could say, actually, the facts here suggest that it's not a shaken baby case, that there are more questions to be asked of the coroner. Why did he say it was the injuries were equivalent to a baby being shaken for 4 or 5 minutes and then being thrown out of a window and landing onto concrete, when that didn't stack up to the truth of what actually the medical reports suggested? And so there's important questions that needed to be asked. You know, was he aware that Himmler did these studies which show that you can get a subdural hematoma, a blood clot on the brain for a fall of less than 3 feet? Was he not aware? Why wasn't he aware? How many cases of children had he done inquests on? How many cases that he properly examined? How many children had he examined? Now, what was interesting, the guy who I spoke to, the world's expert, had done something like 5,000 children autopsies. My guy, well, not my guy, but the Boston coroner had done 5. I think it was 5 or 6. I mean, literally under 10 cases of children dying prematurely or whatever, some, you know, unexplained death. So who would you, in terms of your expert, who would you go with? Would you go with the world's expert that done over 3,000, that done published peer-reviewed studies, or would you go with a guy that done 5 cases? You know what I mean? So
obviously,
just from that alone. Sorry?
Yeah. Obviously, you'll go with that experience.
Yeah. Exactly. So the thing is, what was fascinating about it was the whole case. So I made 3 programs about it and stuff, and we did, you know, again, you know, we examined in detail and stuff, and everything. Like I said, you know, the program went out, and it suddenly mushroomed into this. Like I said, America versus the UK and stuff. They were live streaming the verdict when it went out. I remember, because I was with the family. If you Google Louise Woodward case, guilty verdict, if you Google it, I am sat with the family. I mean, I had hair then. I was a lot younger. I had hair then. The camera moves away from Louise and comes across, and you see me stood there. I'll never forget that day, because Louise has been convicted by the jury of murder, manslaughter. And she screamed. She said, they told me to tell the truth. And she told the truth. And she was convicted. Now, what people didn't know, which was really significant, was that in America, obviously 12 members of the jury, but they have alternate jurors. And if someone's ill or sick or whatever, the alternate jurors can come on board. Now, also the prosecution can say, I don't want one of them alternate jurors to be there, and they can remove them from the jury. And what the prosecution did was that all the people who had a scientific or medical or degree level education, they got rid of them from the jury.
That's convenient. Yeah.
Very convenient. And it was a huge blow to the defense team, the fact that people could understand the science. Because if you could understand the science and the evidence, because the defense was based upon the evidence and reasonable doubt. And it's clear there was reasonable doubt. Now, in any court in the world, if there's reasonable doubt, you acquit.
Yeah.
But they found Louise guilty, because if Louise didn't do it, well, somebody has to account for the baby's death. So they weren't going to blame the parents. But something happened to that baby 3 weeks prior to when Louise was there. And also, the bit of the skull I mentioned before, that part of the skull disappeared. It went missing because the baby was buried. The coroner at the time allowed the baby to be released. It was buried out of state. So there was no chance to re-examine the evidence, the skull, because they could have got that bit of skull and done that forensic thing to see whether it was happened at the same time as the wrist fracture, which was 3 weeks before the actual event when the baby collapsed. That day, that fateful day when the baby died. Well, it didn't die. It died. It was on a life support machine. It died a few days later. But when the baby collapsed, they say. So, because what was described to me by a very senior expert and stuff, he was saying that if two boxers get together and they're being punched and stuff, and you get hit, sometimes there is a process that happens where your brain is surrounded by cerebral fluid and it hits against the skull, and then you think you're bleeding. In fact, it's cerebral fluid coming from your nose, and that means that any slight knock to your head could cause a brain hemorrhage, and you could die as a consequence of that. But that could take a few days later after a fight. That's why they always say about monitoring boxers, because of that fact. It's a known fact. Now, also the cerebral fluid, you can test for that. Yet there was no test because the baby, Louise said, the baby, she thought vomited and stuff because it didn't look, there was no blood, but it looked like there was some vomit. But they didn't do a test to find out whether that was cerebral fluid from the brain. Because according to all the experts I spoke to, was that why didn't they test for that? Because they've tested for that. If that was cerebral fluid, that's exactly what had gone on. There was something had happened that caused that to occur. Any slight knock or whatever would have caused the cerebral fluid to release, and therefore it would have led to the collapse, and the baby would have turned blue and stopped breathing and stuff. So just on the pure science of it, there was reasonable doubt. Anyway, she was convicted, but the American media went ballistic. That the parents were on live TV saying she's a murderer, she should rot in hell and stuff. But what people didn't see was that Louise was taken away by the clerk. We were then escorted out to a room next to the jury room. So we were escorted out. Louise's father collapsed on the floor. I physically picked him up. And it's me and a colleague. We had the anchor for the big story in a hotel suite, waiting to do the interview, because we were hoping to do the interview with Louise, because I was convinced that anyone worth their salt could see there was reasonable doubt she would be acquitted. I couldn't understand that. It was glaring. There was clearly concerns there in terms of how the medical evidence didn't stack up to what the prosecution was saying. The prosecution did not prove their case. It was clear. I mean, everyone saw that. Independent lawyers were saying that on TV. British lawyers over here were saying, well, because it was, the case was streamed live and stuff. They could tell, well, the prosecution haven't won their case and stuff. It's clear that she's going to be acquitted. So they thought. So when the jury found her guilty, it was like, a shock. And not only was it a shock and stuff, but there was stunned silence in the room. Again, I urge people, Google Louise Woodward guilty verdict and see what happened. And we were told to show no emotion.
Was there an appeal?
There was an appeal later on because, again, in Boston, because it's Commonwealth of Massachusetts, Judge Zobel had heard all the evidence himself, and he was able, I think it took 3 or 4 weeks for him to go through everything. He then released her with time served. She'd always been in jail, like I said, in Framingham for over a year and a bit, awaiting trial. Yeah. And he basically said, she's done her time, and he let her go. And it was, he was lambasted by the American press for that. And members of the jury were on TV saying, well, it's outrageous. I think she's a murderer and she should be still there. But it was clear. I mean, this is what it was a real lesson for me in terms of how the American media operated and stuff, because of the way that they portrayed the whole case and stuff. It was shocking. If you're black in America and you get a defense, your average attorney and stuff, you're going to get convicted. I mean, there's no fair, independent judicial system in terms of that. You get what you pay for in America and stuff, and the way that it's presented and stuff, it's very, it was a real eye-opener for me being an outsider watching and seeing this and seeing how they operated there and stuff. It was really shocking.
Yeah, well, it's really, really sad to hear all this, but frankly, Johnny, with coming back to journalism and coming back to the SLAPP litigation, strategic lawsuit against public participation, not me, but Jeffrey Robertson, KC, writes in his book Lawfare, how Russians, the rich, and the government try to prevent free speech. If you got spare the couple of £1 million to spare, you can go after anyone in this country, isn't it? So this is also a fact. If you to be fair, there has to be a balance. But UK is considered, London is considered the libel tourism capital of the world. There was a 2013, amendment to the laws, and the Parliament did bring out serious harm clause, but it's not, I believe, taken seriously, because still the repetition lawyers in London, well, if you got money to file a suit, and if you file a suit, and if you haven't got money to defend yourself, like in your friend's Carol Calwada's case we have seen, so if you don't have a top-notch KC, all right, the King's Counsel in previous days, the Queen's Counsel. Well, there you go. You're looking at bankruptcy. Anyway, I'll move on to the final question. You did go to Afghanistan, and that was really a story which you were telling me earlier. And you covered this in the Helmand province. You covered the British Army deployment and what was going on. And a British intelligence officer told you something very interesting about the Pakistanis. So could you please narrate us the story?
Well, it was interesting. It was for Operation Panther's Claws at the time, where they were moving into Helmand province. And the very senior chap, British military, just said to me, just be very careful of Pakistani intelligence. Be very, very careful with what they say. We don't trust them. That was the words that was used. We don't trust them. So it was fascinating being there. I mean, like I said, I was following the Guardian, so that were there, and it was really interesting just seeing. And it was how the military were dealing with the Afghan National Army and stuff. So this was many years ago now, but it was interesting being there on the ground. I mean, it wasn't really. I wasn't able to do proper journalism because I was embedded with the army. So you are reliant upon them. And, when you do embeds, as they call them, you're not free to roam. It's not like you said before, John Pilger, who covered Vietnam and everything, Cambodia, where you could roam around and speak independently and freely to people. You're with a group of people and you become friends with them. I mean, you're with them, so you kind of, and that rubs off. It does rub off. How can it not rub off on you and stuff? When these people surround, you're with them every day. You're eating with them, sleeping in the same area as them. You get to know their families. That they talk about their families and everything. So you get a very one-sided view of what's going on, and that's the thing. Again, always very careful of journalists who present from one side. It was interesting that how Israeli government allowed certain journalists to go into Gaza with them, with the IDF, because obviously they couldn't report freely. It was what the IDF were telling them, and you have to give your footage and your report for them to sanction, to vet. And if they didn't like anything, they would take it out. So it's not journalism, in fact. Like I said before, journalism is something somebody doesn't want published. The rest is PR. So effectively, you're a propaganda arm for the Israeli government. And that's what, or, in my case, I was working there with the permission of the British Army. So I was kind of like, and they wanted to present that everything was going very well with their relationship with the Afghan National Army, who they were training and who would take over when they leave. And it clearly wasn't going very well. And they didn't want that to come out. So they were very angry. I mean, I've been banned. I'm not allowed to go. I've been banned by the British Army, so I'm not allowed to go. And
that's another thing we share. I've been banned by the Pakistan Army, and they are partners. So you've been banned by the British Army.
Yeah.
So, ladies and gentlemen, that was Giovanni Ulleri, and we originally planned this podcast for 1 hour, but it's gone for 1 hour 30 minutes now. And
I do apologize.
I've enjoyed it. I swear I've enjoyed it. I wanted to go on. But before this podcast, we've been talking off the record for almost an hour. So it's been 2.5 hours, and 2.5 hours of very interesting discussion still. And we would love to have you back, Giovanni. Anything you want to say finally for the aspiring investigative journalists listening? What advice would you give them about courage, ethics, and persistence in the line of work?
The thing is, it's the best job in the world. And I say that knowing that it's stressful, it's not well paid, you work long hours, your family suffers as a consequence. But you mentioned before, Adil, and this is what I agree with you, we're all here for a purpose and stuff. And if you can make life a little bit better, if you can highlight injustice. If someone is doing something wrong, you can point it out and say that is wrong. And it takes courage. It takes people like yourself, like other journalists out there, who are far more courageous than I ever will be, who put their lives on the line every single day, like you have, like other journalists do and stuff. I wish I had half as much courage as you have got, you've been through and stuff, because of some of the things that you've done. But it takes people like that, courageous people, to highlight and give a voice to the voiceless. And that's why we, as journalists, it's a vocation. It's an important job. Like I said, it's in a democracy. It's important that we have courageous individuals. It's a bit like, the story of the emperor with no clothes. And the little boy says, but he's not wearing any clothes. That's the journalist saying, hang on a second, guys. We're all like, do you know the famous story with the emperor no clothes and stuff?
Yeah, it's very famous in Pakistan. In Urdu, you call it Nanga Badshah. And Arshad Sharif, the Pakistan's top-notch award-winning journalist, assassinated by the Pakistani military establishment as alleged by his own mother in the Supreme Court of Pakistan. And she nominated the Pakistani army chief and the Pakistani intelligence chief and so many other officers. He told the story, he narrated the story once again in the current context to the Pakistanis, the story of the Naked King. Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. But so I would urge all, wannabe journalists out there, do journalism. If you want to be an influencer, fine, but that's not journalism. Journalism is a very difficult, like I said, it's a very difficult, very stressful, not very well paid. And so it's a vocation. And you've got to have that thing in your heart where you want to tell people stories. Give people a voice that they don't have. You are the vehicle for them. like I said, whether it's my brother who had appalling treatment by the NHS in the UK, who died of neglect in a teaching hospital, a major teaching hospital and stuff. And I took the hospital to court as a consequence of that, because I call myself a journalist, and I didn't see a story that was right under my nose, right under my very nose. And I didn't see it. And I mean, like I said, I call myself a journalist, and I didn't even see that. I didn't see that story and stuff, because I couldn't, in my own mind, I couldn't imagine them not treating my brother who had Down syndrome in the same way as they would treat me with the same injuries. But they discriminated against him because he had Down syndrome. And that's what I'm saying to you. It doesn't have to be the big stories. It could be a story close to home. So any wannabe would-be journalists out there, look closer to home and stuff for any stories of injustice or corruption or anything. It could be small things that go on and stuff that it's important to tell. We need to call out to make the world a better place, a more ethical place, an important place. And I want, I stand on the shoulders of other people that have done far more courageous things, like yourself, like other journalists out there, like other people out there who are courageous and say, no, you can't do that. In America and stuff with the civil rights movement and stuff, where a little black girl wanted to go to school and stuff, and yet she was attacked by it, because she was black, and it's important that we stand together and stuff. And if you've got, an ounce of compassion and I suppose it's like one of those weird things, like I said to you before, it's almost like journalism is something which, if it wasn't there, you'd have to invent it and stuff, because it's important that people hold people to account, corporations, politicians, businessmen, because if they are exploiting somebody else, it's important that we call them to account for that. If someone is preying on children, preying on the vulnerable and stuff, it needs people to say, no, you can't do that. Otherwise, we live in a tyranny. Otherwise, we allow fascism. Otherwise, we allow dictatorship and stuff. And we can't accept that. We're all equal. We're all the same. We all eat, breathe, eat, everything else that we do. We're all equal, and we should be treated equally. And I think it's important that we keep telling stories. It's all about telling stories and keep finding and looking for the truth. Truth, like I said before, if I leave with one people one thing, truth doesn't change. Truth is there. It stays and stuff. But we need to have people that will focus on that and keep telling truth and holding power to account. I'll end on that.
Thank you so very much, ladies and gentlemen. This was Giovanni Ulleri, and it was a pleasure to have him. And we hope that he comes back and joins us. This was not only Journalism 101, but this program was, I would title it, In the Name of Justice. That's from where it all started, the discussion. And all what we are doing it in the name of justice. And journalism is definitely the new frontier between the good and evil, which we talk about. And honest journalism and the honest investigative journalism does really make a difference, no matter even if it's on social media or on mainstream media, wheresoever it is. If you're taking it as a sacred duty, I would say, then you are making a difference, and you'll be looked after, if not here, somewhere else maybe, or you'll be looked after by the forces which we cannot see, but which is definitely there, which is running the universe. That is my concept of it. Thank you so very much, Giovanni. Thank you for joining us.
Keep up the good work, Adil. Keep it up. We need people like you.
Cheers. Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye.